Christian McCaffrey and Chuba Hubbard have a wide range of fantasy outlooks. They could be top 10 running backs or huge busts in 2025. We talk through the top 6 toughest running backs to rank on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for making us your first listen every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com.
We are going to discuss the 6 toughest running backs to rank for 2025 as we currently sit here at the end of March, and we're going through our rankings and trying to, polish them up. It's just there's some players that are much trickier than others because there's such a wide range of outcomes for them. So let's start at the top here at Christian McCaffrey, because I do think he is the number one most hard guy to rank this year, at least among the running backs. We know he was so dominant there for so long, running back 1 in 2023, running back 2 in 22. We had a couple more running back 1 seasons earlier as well. But now he's dealing with Achilles tendonitis that made him miss most of last season. The offensive line for the 49ers, particularly the interior offensive line, is kind of in shambles. But, there's very little competition. They traded away Deebo Samuel, which should lead to more targets for Christian McCaffrey. They traded away Brandon Ayuk as well, or not traded away. Brandon Ayuk is injured, and we'll see when he can get back in the middle of the season or possibly get traded. He is on the block. And then they traded away Jordan Mason, the running back. That would be the biggest competition for Christian McCaffrey. So there's pluses and there's minuses to this offseason. Are you more on the side of worry with the injury or more on the side of he's going to have so much opportunity next year, he has to be ranked high?
Yeah, it seems like it's every other year or so for Christian McCaffrey where you trust him. I think however you look at it, he has got probably a year and a half left of good football, maybe 2 left into that body. And since he got in the league, he's had a high volume for the Panthers, not just rushing the ball, but receiving. He has missed quite a bit of time that has contained his mileage here over his 2 stops in the NFL. But I think he probably has one more special season in him. The question is it this year? Is it next year? How is it all going to play out for him? And you'd think the 49ers, if they were a little bit worried, they would have thought about keeping Jordan Mason or Elijah Mitchell, who ended up signing with the Chiefs in free agency. So those 2 guys have been his primary backups of late. The only thing they did was bring back Kyle Juszczyk after releasing him. They re-signed him. So they don't seem to be too worried unless they believe totally in Isaac Orendo being a bigger factor, but he's a guy that also got hurt last season. So let's see what they do. They also didn't sign a veteran, right? I mean, they could have had Raheem Mostert or someone like that as a bit of insurance. They didn't do it. So again, that says they're probably positive on the outlook for McCaffrey. But I think what you have to do is just realize he's not one of those players where if you draft him early, he's going to be a disappointment if he's healthy, right? He's not going to finish RB10 if he plays all those games. He's going to finish way above that. Really, the question is, if you'd invest in him in RB10, are you comfortable with that? Because there's a chance things could just fall out here. And I think maybe you'd feel a little bit more comfortable if they clarified that backup situation a little bit more, where it's been quite ambiguous between Mason and Mitchell, and then those guys haven't been able to stay healthy, and Garendo wasn't. So maybe they clarified in the draft, right? Get a 3rd, 4th round pick or something. They invest somewhat decently in a backup. Then you might say, okay, I can draft McCaffrey. I can draft this backup that's like him, and we can just go in that direction and have the handcuff insurance and just take the floor of that running back in the 49ers running game. So again, I personally think I don't want to take the chance. There's just too many guys that I could draft ahead of him or in that range. Where you look at all the studs that came through last year, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs. This year you could have people emerge in that group. We know Bijan Robinson is there. Maybe Breece Hall has an ascending year. There's a lot of people. Bucky Irving. We go through a lot of these guys that are up there that maybe less volatile, a little younger, and you go in that direction. But if you start to get to a situation where you get to a guy that's similar but doesn't have the same upside, then you take McCaffrey, right? I think it has to be a feature back that is going to get a lot of touches. Like, you're not going to take McCaffrey over Gibbs or Robinson or Barkley or Henry. But if you get to a thing, toss up between him and another similar situation back, I think you take him no matter what and then go get his backup later. So hopefully we have clarity of the backup situation. That's the only way I draft McCaffrey, if I can guarantee or force myself to also take who looks like to be his number 2 on the depth chart.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more open to taking him than some other people will be with the nerves, especially because we saw him in 4 games last year. He didn't do much, right, for fantasy. So I also think that's going to keep people a little bit worried too. But I mean, in both of his first 2 games of the season, week 10 and 11, he had over 100 scrimmage yards, right? He got 20 touches in those games at least. And they were fine fantasy games. He just didn't get into the end zone to give him that like huge fantasy weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And week 12, Brock Purdy doesn't play, and they get smashed by the Packers in Green Bay. So, yeah, he gets 15 touches, 68 yards, doesn't do much. But, again, without Brock there, he doesn't get too many targets. And then week 13, he gets injured pretty quickly in that game in Buffalo. But within just 12 snaps he played in that game, he already had 3 targets from CMC or from Brock Purdy. He already had 7 carries in that game. So he's going to be used so much as long as he stays healthy. And like I said, without Deebo there, with Ayuk, who knows when he'll be back? There's going to be so many targets his way too. The touchdowns will come. That's never been his issue throughout his career. So I really like Christian McCaffrey as long as he can stay healthy. But the Achilles tendonitis can pop back up anytime. And that is the worry going with him. But I'm still going to keep him as a top 5 running back in my rankings for now. Now, another guy that's not going as early as Christian McCaffrey, doesn't have that same type of name, that big name star. But Chuba Hubbard, he was the running back 12 in points per game last year, running back 9 from weeks 3 through 16. He missed the last 2 weeks of the season. But there's some things that are making this hard to figure out where to place him, right? Because that was his first time he broke out last year. Also, the Panthers signed Rico Dowdle in free agency. And I do think they're similar talents, right? Jonathan Brooks may be back at some point in this next season after tearing his ACL again. But really the biggest thing here that I'm worried about is Hubbard just saw so much playing time. From week 6 through 16, he saw 85% of the team's offensive snaps. I mean, just an insane rate for a running back. So if he gets that taken away just a little bit, we could see him bounce back quite greatly, where it's hard to figure out where to rank him.
Yeah, I think for now you have to kind of read into what the Panthers have done. I mean, Rico Dowdle, look, that's just a backup style back at this point. I mean, I know he had to start out of necessity for the Cowboys, but the other thing you look at is Jonathan Brooks did not work out, so they wanted to maybe ease the burden, and Miles Sanders was also kind of moved on from as well. So I think they're just trying to find a better backup situation, because don't forget they did give Hubbard a contract extension, partly because Brooks was not reliable, and they said, okay, this was a wasted pick. This guy's had another knee setback. It may never be the same. Brooks had a lot of upside, so it was a worthy flyer for them to take a shot on Brooks, but clearly that looks like it won't pan out, just because, again, you can't really recover from injuries like that back to back. It just doesn't happen. So when you look at that, I think Hubbard's in a great spot to be an RB2. I'm not going to bump him too high up the rankings right now. You look at him, I mean, we had McCaffrey ascending to RB10, while Hubbard is kind of holding steady as RB17 in half-point PPR. So I don't know if I can push him that more. I don't know if he's all that exciting, right? I mean, in relation to other backs that you can get in that range of the RB2 mid to late. Like, I don't know if he just has a ton of upside. I think he has a decent floor because the Panthers will use him, but I don't see the same outcomes for him. I think they want to open up the passing game. I don't know if they like Hubbard as much in those situations, and Dowdle was decent there for the Cowboys doing that. So, again, I'm not going to go nuts on Hubbard. I still think because of his volume, he's an RB2, but I'd probably take him after that RB17 mark.
Yeah, so much. There was 4 games where he got just so many touches that kind of skews the end of his fantasy season. So he had 4 games with 25 plus touches last year. He averaged nearly 25 fantasy points per game in those games in half PPR. Then in the 11 other games, he had fewer than 25 touches, which 25 touches is a ton. He averaged 11.2 fantasy points per game in those games. So went from an elite running back to a barely usable one. So If Rico Dowdle does just take away some of those touches, I do think we could be a bit disappointed. But if he gets the work, then yeah, he can definitely be a top 12 running back again. So that's the struggle here with ranking him. But I do think that 17 range is very fair for him and should be right around there. We have 4 more running backs that we're going to talk about that are the toughest to rank for next year. I know you and I think we're different on Breece Hall, and we're going to get into him right after a quick break.
This episode, Locked On Fantasy Football, is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. March Madness is now down to the Final Four. We have all 4 number 1 seeds battling for the championship. Who will cut down the nets in San Antonio? Will it be Duke? Will it be Auburn? Will it be Houston? Or will it be Florida? Great grouping of teams there. Going to be a lot of great action there. And get in on it. And the best place to do that is with FanDuel. Like never before, you can get in and bet on the Final Four. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 in extra bucks to use everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. It's going to happen here soon next weekend. Just check it out. Duke and Auburn look to be the favorites, but you might want to go the other direction and get some value with Houston or Florida. Stay in the action with the tournament games happening all throughout the weekend. We got, again, 3 more to go here, so get in on it with the action and the stakes raised. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com to get on the college hoops action before it's too late. The tournament is ending, so good time to get in on that sport here. So, again, check it out only at FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, Michelle, it is time to continue the show and look at some other running backs that are hard to rank, and we are definitely different on this next running back. I've been touting Breece Hall. I like the situation here with what they're doing with Justin Fields with the Jets. He's at RB12, so right behind Christian McCaffrey, 2 spots higher, 5 spots ahead of Chuba Hubbard. What are you thinking about Breece Hall? Because I think he's maybe undervalued here based on his upside in fantasy.
See, this is so hard for Breece Hall because you watch him and there's definitely times you see the talent and we know he has great burst and we've seen him both in 2023 and 2022 be the running back 7 in points per game. So we've seen him be a good fantasy running back, at least on a season with inconsistencies in there. And then last year, running back 18, so fell off a bit in points per game. This is my worry with Breece Hall this year. And you bring up Justin Fields that you like that. I don't, because we know Justin Fields isn't a check down guy, right? And Breece Hall, so much of his fantasy efficiency has come from those targets and getting those receptions. Even just last year, when you're looking at it, in the 6 games, he had at least 6 targets. He averaged 20 fantasy points per game in half PPR. In the 10 games with fewer than 6 targets, 9.5 points per game. I just don't see him getting 6 targets per game with Justin Fields, he's not the check down guy. He's going to take off and run. Plus, Fields could steal goal line work. Plus, Braylon Allen, coming into his 2nd season, could steal carries, also goal line work because he's a big back. So I actually think I'm going to be lower on Breece Hall than what consensus says right now. Would you say running back 12, 13? I don't think I can get him up there. I mean, he's not going to be much lower than that, but he's not a guy I'm going to be, trying to get in drafts.
Yeah, I selfishly want him to stay kind of lower, and I want to be able to think about him in a spot maybe a little bit beyond where I think he can actually finish. That would be great in drafts. Now, look, this offense is a little bit different from what Justin Fields has run before. He's been with Arthur Smith. He's been with Luke Getsy. They've been pretty run heavy, but this is a Lions offshoot offense here with Tanner Engstrand. And I think they're going to do some of their concepts with the running game. Now it's a difference, right? You have a running quarterback where you had Jared Goff, a strictly pocket passer here. But I think they're running together with Fields is going to be rather special in this offense. I think they're going to be kind of intrigued by what they can do with the zone read. So I think you'll see some smart wrinkles for what you're looking for. And again, the checkdowns is something Justin Fields needs to do a little bit more of. And look, he has Garrett Wilson, but they really are hurting for underneath targets. So I think that's something that you have to think about as well, where they need to maybe design some plays for Breece Hall where they get him the open field. He can take any ball and if he has a little bit of space, and take it to the house. That's how explosive this guy is. So you want to get the ball in his hands as much as possible. If teams are trying to come in and stop the run, you want to get him out in open space. And I also think this offensive line is in transition. The Jets need to do something up here. I mean, they did not bring back Tyron Smith. They didn't bring back Morgan Moses. So they need to get to the edge somehow. So that's a little bit of a concern, right? I think they might need to prioritize offensive tackle a little higher than expected in the draft. So I'm looking forward to what the Jets do to build on this. But Breece Hall, this is a talent-based thing for me. I think the talent is there, and he's healthy enough where I think he can have a big year. If he's used properly, I think I trust the Lions coaching staff that's now in New York to do that for him.
Another running back who's very, very talented, but has been inconsistent throughout his career in fantasy is Kenneth Walker, and he's going to be our next guy that's the toughest to rank. Last year, he was a running back 15 in fantasy points per game at 14.5 points per game. That was a career high. His first 2 years, he was sitting around 12.5 points per game, so a nice little jump up for him last year. And he also had a career high in receptions and receiving yards last season, despite only playing 11 games. So they definitely utilized him more in that area. Now they have a new OC, though, a new quarterback. We don't know if he's still going to get those targets. And I mentioned he played 11 games. He really only played 8 games with his actual workload. Some games in there where he didn't see his typical workload. But in the 8 games with at least 10 carries last season, he averaged 16.5 points per game. That would have put him as running back 7 in points per game behind only Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, and Alvin Kamara. So I do think he could be a really good value, and I want to be able to draft him in the top 10. But those concerns, like I said, with the change of quarterback, with the change of OC, with Zach Charbonnet, maybe he gets more work, with also his injury history. It just feels like Walker's always dealing with some sort of injury. That's where it makes it hard to get him up there.
Yeah, the funny thing with Kenneth Walker, I had him on a team, and I also had Zach Charbonnet, and I was almost like, oh, if Kenneth Walker's out, oh, easy. I'm going to plug and play Charbonnet. I'm going to have a big game from him. But I didn't always feel that way when Walker was in the lineup. Like, I wasn't excited because he had to share with Charbonnet in a lot of these games. So I think Clint Kubiak and this offensive coaching staff, they're going to the old school, kind of the Kubiak offense from his dad, right? Rick Dennison has long been the Kubiak associate. When they were in Houston, he was been in Denver. So that means a zone blocking, running game, the classic thing that we get from Kubiak's and Shanahan's here. So I think they're going to maybe diversify it. I think Charbonnet has a little explosiveness that they can look at. And I think they're going to use these backs a lot. And I think they're going to give them a high volume combined, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to run Walker into the ground. I think he's proved he can't do that. He's going to break down if you give him too many carries. So I think there's going to be a bit of a split here. Charbonnet is actually rising pretty fast here, down in the 30s, I believe, in rankings. That would make sense with Walker being an RB15 at the moment. So a little bit nervous. Walker's durability is actually right up there with McCaffrey's. I mean, the problem with Walker is he's available, but he's always seeming to be hurt. Like there's an oblique injury, there's a hamstring. So you don't know if we get to Wednesday or Thursday if this guy's going to suit up. He's always hurt. So that's really hard unless you can get Charbonnet later. So I think I would try to get Charbonnet late in drafts as some upside here for this new running game because they're not committed to Walker, right? This is a different school offense. They're going to move on for a second time. So we've seen it with Dave Canales and what they were doing there. We saw it with Ryan Grubb. Yet a new pivot in the offense is going to go to maybe a little bit more diversification with the weapons and all that. So I would say Kenneth Walker is a little too rich for me. Again, I would want to move him down right there with Hubbard based on the situation and be a lot more interested in McCaffrey and Hall.
So I would be more interested in Walker than Breece Hall, but yes, more interested in McCaffrey than Kenneth Walker as well. Just because you're nervous about the injuries for both Walker and Christian McCaffrey, but if one of them's going to be healthy all year long, then Christian McCaffrey has a way higher ceiling. So if I'm going to take that risk, I'm going to go with CMC over Walker. But yeah, I like Walker over Breece Hall and Chuba Hubbard for next season. But we have 2 more running backs to get through. These are guys that are not going to be going early in drafts whatsoever, but they still have a wide range of outcomes come next year. And it really could go anywhere from being a top 15 guy to being completely useless. So we have to talk about them. We'll get to Tony Pollard and Tank Bigsby right after a quick break. All right, let's talk about Tony Pollard. Last year, first season with the Titans, he finished as a running back 22 in points per game. He did have like some really solid games throughout the year. The end of the season was a big disappointment in the fantasy playoffs, all pretty bad games. But I mean, throughout the year, he had 16, 13, 17, 6. Like, I can keep going down. And there's a bunch of games in the teens and even a game with 20 fantasy points. And he offers something in fantasy, right? He does. We just have to figure out what it is. Can he be a running back 2 again next year? Tyjae Spears did miss a decent amount of time last season, and that was when Pollard had some of his best games. And then how much scoring opportunity will the Titans have next year? Who will be the quarterback? Will it be Cam Ward? Does that help or hurt Tony Pollard? All these questions make Tony Pollard a very, very hard guy to rank for 2025.
Yeah, I mean, look at all the things that didn't quite work out. They had an offensive line in transition again, trying to figure out all the pieces to come together. They've invested some up front quite a bit, and it hasn't all come together the way they had it a few years ago with Derrick Henry. So there were some questions up front. There were definitely some questions of the passing game with Will Levis and how much pressure they could take off. And Pollard still finished as a pretty solid RB2 last year. So I think things are going to go a little bit better. We'll see about Tyjae Spears and how much we want to use him. But I think Cam Ward is more of a downfield passing quarterback. You may not see as many checkdowns, but I also see the Titans maybe leaning a little bit more on the run. Ward can run. And I think Pollard is a solid back. We've seen it with the Cowboys. We've seen it now with the Titans. I think he's got some upside here and some juice, and he doesn't have that high volume because he started out as a little bit of a backup or a change of pace. So now he's in a position where if they use him right, and I think they saw a lot of things he can do well, where he can finish better in the red zone than I think people expected early, and then just a guy that can also get in the open field and explode a little bit. So when I look at Pollard, again, there's a little bit of untapped upside there. I think there's a reason they signed him for this offense the last year. So I see some things where he's a pretty good value to me, Michelle. I think it's just saying, look, if he was 24, you're going to knock him down when things might be improving all around him. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. So I think he's a guy that, again, I might want to target as a better value, not saying I'm going to take him over these guys, but Hubbard and Walker, like, I think Pollard is more ascending to where they are at this point because things seem to be tipping in the right direction with the Titans backfield and the usage, and now the quarterback upside that's about to come in with Cam Ward.
Yeah, I mean, it can't. You would hope that it can't get worse than Will Levis, right? And he did only have 5 rushing touchdowns all year long, Tony Pollard, but it's just the offense wasn't scoring much. So hopefully Cam Ward can come in, give them more scoring opportunities, which would make Tony Pollard a lot more interesting in fantasy. So yeah, he could be a great value next year for sure. The last guy I want to hit on is Tank Bigsby. I'm actually not too confused where to rank him, but I know his rankings are going to be all over the place because of Liam Cohen there and people excited that what he can turn into. Like, can he be the next Bucky Irving with Liam Cohen? But last year, running back 40 in points per game at just 7.8 points per game. That was slightly better, though, than his teammate Travis Etienne at 7.4 points per game. So both were terrible. I just want to point out Bigsby had 12 targets all season long, 16 games played. He's just not using that area at all. He had more than 10 fantasy points in just 3 games, one of those games being a 12-point game, but he did have 2 really big games. And then fewer than 5 fantasy points in 8 of 16 games played last year, 50% of his games. And he was getting touches. He had 7 games with at least 12 touches. Again, only 2 good games out of those 7. I just don't personally think he's all that talented. And I know people really like him. I just think he's just a guy. I think Travis Etienne is by far the better running back overall, by far the better playmaker. I know last year he didn't really show it. He wasn't really motivated, but I just can't imagine Liam Cohen coming in and prioritizing Bigsby over Etienne. So I'm going to have him rank low, but I know a lot of people, he's going to be ranked all over the place.
Yeah, this is a very hard guy to rank for me because I liked maybe the concept of Bigsby getting a longer look from a new coaching staff, but I could also see the Jaguars adding a different running back to this mix. More and more I think about it as I've looked at the draft, I think they would be in the mix for one. I think the highest priority for the Jaguars, upgrading the offensive line. I mean, they brought back Brandon Sheriff. Cam Robinson was traded to the Vikings, and now he was signed by the Texans, I should say. So when he's gone and they're trying to figure out their offensive line, I think that's the first thing they got to fix to trust. then you wonder if the Jaguars' defense is really going to hold up and if they're going to have to throw quite a bit and they're in transition again. And you also have Liam Cohen, who likes to throw downfield and be aggressive with the receivers for Trevor Lawrence. And the Bigsby not catching passes hurts. And kind of weird, Travis Etienne is not all that great at being in that role. Maybe he's been miscast, but they forced him with different coaches, right? Going back to Urban Meyer and then Doug Peterson. They have not been able to unlock in the passing game, and maybe that's just a little bit of his limitation. So they could go after a dedicated kind of receiving back, and then you get a three-headed monster. Keep in mind, last year, they were sorting things out between Rachaad White and Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker at times. They were just trying to figure out who's the guy, and then Irving kind of pulled away. I'm not sure any of these backs have that special ability to pull away. Maybe it's the third unknown back that will come in and do that. So, again, I think I'm not worried too much about the rankings of Etienne and Bigsby because I'm not going to be targeting either in fantasy drafts to be short. I mean, I just don't feel like when we talked about those other backfields where I want a piece of those backfields, just might be different on where, and maybe with exclusion of the Panthers. But with this backfield of Jaguars, I'm not going to say it's a recreation and a copy. And you're right. I don't think Bigsby is nearly as talented as Bucky Irving, and they have some limitations that Irving does not have, and Liam Cohen might find those out pretty quickly.
And I do think Etienne is being massively overlooked, I think, this offseason because of last year. Like, he is very, very skilled. He has insane burst. He can bring anything to the house. It was a really bad year for him last year. And he'll probably be on a lot of my teams if he's going to fall as far as I think he will. So we could have had him on here too with the hardest, but we've talked about Etienne a bit more this offseason. So I wanted to talk about Tank Bigsby, but that is it for today's show. I want to thank you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'll be back talking to you tomorrow, having a fun April Fool's episode. And then the rest of the week, we'll get through the other positions and the toughest players to rank throughout those positions. Don't miss those episodes. Talk to you then. Bye, y'all.